Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our professionals have acquired years of experience, which ensures you get the very best. Our experienced staff is waiting to hear from you and to answer any specific questions that you may have on how we can meet your needs. Just ask for a consultation and let us prove our commitment to you as we promise to maintain the highest level of quality and commitment. Your satisfaction is our prime concern. So please, don't hesitate to get in contact with us and let us show you all the great options we have.
Good evening and welcome to Pump Up the Volume, where we're lifting up community voices and many of the issues that you will not be hearing on mainstream media, amplifying those issues for the public to better understand what crisis we're currently confronted with in the state of Rhode Island, how we can face that crisis, and ultimately who's doing the fighting at the grassroots level. So today, joining me as always here Tuesdays at 7:30 p.m. is Mr. Roberto Gonzalez from Steambox, Rhode Island. Thank you, Roberto, for being with us. These gentlemen at this point are kind of my co-host here. Mr. Bill Bartholomew from the Bartholomew Town podcast. Thank you so much, Bill, out there, indie media just pushing against the grains, as they say. And Mr. Pat Ford, also the founder of the Coalition Network, which has given us this forum to, again, amplify the voices of community. So thank you so much, Pat, for joining us. All of these gentlemen are my friends, but also they are active community leaders, also active in their respective professions, each bringing a different perspective on issues that are happening on the ground, from youth-led movements to, again, the various facets of the crisis that we're currently faced with, as well as individuals that themselves are presenting challenging questions to the administration here in the state of Rhode Island, but also addressing kind of larger questions, right, in terms of society and our national government. So thank you again, gentlemen, for joining us. I want to have a more structured approach to today's Pump Up the Volume episode. You know, normally we tackle these issues, we let the conversation evolve, and we kind of see where we end up. And I think that that's been great, and we certainly enjoy that. But today we do want to touch on several important topics. The first one will ultimately, will essentially be this notion of cancel culture. I'd love to get some perspective on what each of the members of here on Pump Up the Volume think about the kind of recent movements that have happened, from the bringing down of statues to the challenging of names that have implications that negative connotations associated with them due to our history of slavery here in the state of Rhode Island. But in order to really kind of get some perspective and content around that, I'd love to start again with Mr. Bill Bartholomew and see whether Bill can give us kind of some perspective on how this has been talked about in the media airwaves, and what are some of the stories that have transpired over the past 7 days since we were last on Pump Up the Volume. Bill, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, good evening, gentlemen, and good evening, everyone out there enjoying this fine program. Now, maybe you've made a habit of it on Tuesday nights. Well, it depends on which media outlet you're listening to or watching in terms of how this is being described. I think the objective standpoint is that you've got situations that are superficial with respect to the Providence Plantations component of our state name, with respect to removing statues, so on and so forth, that some folks are saying, well, wait a minute, you're erasing history by removing these. What you're doing is you're kind of playing into a mob mentality. And then on the other hand, you've got folks who are saying, well, wait a minute, this is so simple. It's such a superficial, to use that word again, basic, easy fix to address concerns of certain communities and, frankly, all of us about things that are just plain offensive or ridiculous based on the reality of the historical context. When you talk about Christopher Columbus, here's someone who has been idolized and turned into a fairy tale of sorts, but at the same time is a known pillager, murderer, and rapist. So the airwaves have been abuzz with both sides of that. And as is the case with many of these types of issues, depending on which side you're on, the other side considers you a complete radical and lunatic for having the opposite position.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for sharing that perspective, Bill. And I'd love to also get Pat's perspective on this. Pat, you always really bring to the table a lot of like historical references around how history has evolved and some of the occurrences here in the state of Rhode Island. I'd love to just open it up, Pat, for you to share anything you'd like. But if you happen to want to share on the kind of inception of Columbus Day, why Columbus was chosen as this kind of symbol for the Italian American community, it would be great for our listeners to get some type of perspective on that. If you'd like to, we can always field that for a later discussion if you'd like as well.
Well, it's interesting to me because if I remember my grade school history correctly, while certainly the Italian community celebrates Mr. Columbus, wasn't it the Spanish who paid the bill? So I've never quite understood what the whole Italian American connection was, other than the guy drove the boat. I come from a political perspective where we don't engage in hero worship. Interestingly enough, in 2016, our presidential candidate was, there was a lot of gotcha interviews because he was seen as someone who would be tearing up Clinton votes or Trump votes. And so a lot of journalists went after them with the gotcha things. And one of them was, who were the historical leaders you most admire? Well, I come from a minarchist near anarchist background. I don't admire political leaders. I admire individuals and their courage and perhaps their what they've accomplished in their life. But this hero worship that we have across the country for a variety of political figures who, for lack of a better term, have been whitewashed and who, quite frankly, many of them are quite despicable, is bizarre to me. I just have never gotten it. And while obviously I'm going to object to the Washington statue being tumbled, you do have to pause to reflect the fact that these folks engaged in slavery, and the notion historically that slavery was just kind of a thing that happened because it was the time is nonsense, because if you follow the Quaker movement and you follow a variety of human rights movements that were even evolving at that time, there was already quite a protest against slavery. So I'm sorry, owning other people, you don't get a pass. So just enough of this, enough of the nonsense. Let's reflect instead on the ways people can come together today to evolve the world, and understand that if you think that some of these folks from the past were wonderful, imagine then how you would feel going forward when you realize that Donald Trump will probably get a statue. Yikes. Might be time to rethink that. That's my thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Pat. We know that it didn't become a federal holiday until 1937, but there was a lot of lobbying done by the Knights of Columbus. And, when I learned that fact, it was really hard to understand, because part of me wanted to believe, and this is not factual, but a part of me wanted to believe that that Columbus Day was kind of one of those gifts, right? Gifts that American culture early in the century was attempting to give communities that had actively oppressed, right, through lack of economic opportunity, through obviously systemic racism. Part of me wanted to believe that Columbus Day was one of those things, right, where the community had no other way to celebrate their heritage except to take a villain and to transform that villain into a hero. Unfortunately, I didn't find any enough history, right, or historical clues to build that case. And that was a piece of this for me that was a little, a bit more frustrating, because, understanding, having studied in Italy, understanding how beautiful Italian culture is, you also, understand that there's a history of racism even in Italy, right? Southern Italians that had darker skin were often judged differently than Northern Italians. And the migration of Italians here to the U.S., many of them did come from Southern Italy. So if we go back to our history, a lot of that history of oppression, that racism, whether it's blatant or systemic, it was confronted by even Italian communities today. And so again, like we have a common history, may not be common to the extent that it happened at the same time, but the struggle, right, that our communities have encountered. And yet we find ourselves here debating whether the statue of a man that, actively enabled genocide should stand because a community has transformed that villain into a hero, because really that was the holiday that was given to them to some extent, right? Whether it was the idea that I had or the fact that it was established by the federal government in 1937 due to lobbying efforts. So anyway, this is more reflective. I'm not reaching so much a conclusion, or I guess I do have a few conclusions in there, but I do want to empathize with our Italian American brothers and sisters and just people. At the end of the day, like, they do have a beautiful heritage. We just probably could find better heroes to celebrate. So Roberto, what are your thoughts? Obviously this has a huge impact on many of our community members in Providence and throughout the state, but those that, reflect our indigenous community, our Black community, African-American community. So just what are your thoughts, especially if you want to even bring in the youth perspective on this? We'd love to hear.
I think you hit it right on when you mentioned that there are other ways to celebrate the beautiful culture in Italy, right? So there are so many other things that you could bring into this. And what I'm thinking about is, forgive me for 1 second here. I'm thinking about a number of these things, like the Columbus statue that, first of all, they said it was in the wrong neighborhood, but it doesn't matter, because if it's offending parts of Providence, it doesn't matter if you put it on Federal Hill, it's going to offend parts of Providence. When are those parts of Providence not welcome on Federal Hill, or should they be expected to have a monster to their culture in Federal Hill? And there are other things too that this makes me think of. I think of an educator's perspective, right? Not necessarily the youth perspective, but from the perspective of an educator, I look at an opportunity for Columbus Day and for VJ Day. We don't need them, right? Like, there are other ways to have history. I don't need that statue there to create a learning opportunity. But VJ Day, I certainly use that opportunity to talk about some of the things that went down, and what does VJ Day actually mean to some of the students, right? Like, is this something that we should be celebrating? Is this something that we should be mourning? I want to also be really careful about, so I wanted to point that out, right? Like, there's an educator's perspective where there's an opportunity to right some of the wrongs, some of the things that we were taught in school. But there's a dangerous element too, right? Like, do we throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? Like, for numerous reasons, before allegations came widely publicized with Bill Cosby, right? Like, he was already slightly offensive to me with the way that he talked down to much of my community. So I was already not necessarily a fan. But what does that mean about the Cosby Show? Does that, like, the Cosby Show wasn't putting drinks in, putting things in people's drinks. So I wonder about these things. But just like I'm talking about with moving the statue to Federal Hill, right? Like, if that image and that imagery is hurting people, then I understand where it needs to go. But the reason I'm blurring the line is with intention, because very recently there was somebody who was working with my students. One of the stars he wasn't working with my students. It was, I'm exaggerating. We did a screening of the movie Into the Spider-Verse, and one of the stars was talking to the students. And afterward, that star, who's a young Black man, had something to say about Rosa Parks and that how she should have taken a cab, and it was gross. And as he expounded, it just got grosser. Like, everything that he had to say to support, his bullshit comments just got weirder and worse and worse. And this is somebody people look up to. Now, I understand that I'm the nerd of the group, right? But I've got to say, it's super special to not only grow up on Spider-Man, but as a Puerto Rican, to now have a Puerto Rican Spider-Man. And this is the voice of the Puerto Rican Spider-Man who's saying shit like Rosa Parks should have taken a cab, right? Like, it's gross. But what does that mean about the movie that's so special to me? What does that mean about the upcoming sequel that I can't wait for, right? Like to take my son to and enjoy this with. And man, we cried with a group of like 40 of my students watching that movie. What does it mean to the Harry Potter fans that J.K. Rowling this week is coming across as super transphobic? She is really hurting a lot of people and a lot of her own audience. So my question is, does this mean that we should be throwing out Harry Potter? Or does this mean, to Pat's point, that maybe we shouldn't be idolizing some of these people so much?
Yeah, I think one interesting thing real quick is, you think about the amount of the brand that the New England Patriots have built around here. And then you remember the fact that that's basically a wing of the Trump campaign, former quarterback Tom Brady, Bill Belichick, the coach, the owner, Robert Kraft, and certainly when you look at football at large with Colin Kaepernick and that entire situation there, the brain damage that's been proven, the exploitation that goes on, where do you draw the line? You still have so many people who wear Patriots apparel. Sometimes, they think they're getting dressed up and they put on a uniform with a player's name on it. That type of idolization, oftentimes from communities, not particularly, but just sometimes by communities that are oppressed by Donald Trump. So should we stop watching football or stop watching the New England Patriots as a protest against Donald Trump? I'm not sure. It is a difficult pill to swallow if you're cheering on Tom Brady, knowing that the man had a MAGA hat in his locker just a couple of years ago.
I also think that we have to put this in perspective. You've brought up really profound or deep questions here, Roberto, as you tend to do. I think, if we were to summarize the kind of, if this were a chess game, you have the funders, you have the framers, and you have the deliverers, right? You have those that fund candidates or funded Columbus or fund the production of a film. You have the framers, those great speech writers, great script writers, right? Those that really can take these profound issues that we're faced with culturally and in society and bottle it up into a nice story. And then you have the deliverers, the Bill Cosbys, the politician, that serves as the medium to that message that has been framed. And I would just say that, culpability lies everywhere on that spectrum. If we can't, quote unquote, cancel one and not the other, and because again, each of them in this system have a role, and that role is intentional. And so we can't disconnect the speechwriter from the ideology that is inherent in the speech that they've written or in the script that's been written. So there are good and bad things about that, right? Because it empowers people, but ultimately we know that it's leaning in a direction that the funders want, or ultimately in a direction that the deliverer that's expressed that message wants. So Cosby's a side issue. It's even hard to kind of, because that's, to tear that apart it will take a few episodes, but I just want to put it in perspective. I think from my perspective, like Spain is as culpable as Columbus was, right? And all of the counselors and wise people that were around Columbus that were probably feeding him advice are just as culpable as well, even though history has forgotten their names.
My only question about this, though, is where do we separate art from, in terms of cancel culture, when art is really an independent expression as opposed to the negative behaviors that lead to cancel culture? And I don't have an answer for that, but I would say comedy in particularly has taken a beating, because very often the comic expression is not the expression of the individual, but really nothing unlike, say, a painting or a piece of music. It's just that the words in comedy can be offensive. They can be politically incorrect. They can be brutal. So I that's the only question I have. Where do we celebrate art from bad behavior of individuals?
Can I add to that it makes me think a lot about when do people have an opportunity to evolve, right? So we think about all of these numerous subjects, right? There's racism, there is homophobia, in J.K. Rowling's case, transphobia specifically. The NFL has really been a party to its players being really abusive to women and having a really nasty locker room culture. Um, and then we think about certain jokes that haven't aged as well from 80s movies when they use F words to talk about gay people, right? Or like, or some of these other things. And then, so let's go back in time. Let's go back in time, maybe 2 decades ago to when we might have said something stupid, right? Like, and these people obviously we're aging with the world and we're hopefully evolving with the world. And as we get new information, we're evolving and learning and doing better. But I'm hoping that a young Shamik Moore, the star of Spider-Man and this Netflix show that I watched that was really cool, I'm hoping that he has an opportunity to transform himself and learn from this. And I'm hoping somebody pulls him under their wing and educates him. I'm hoping that J.K. Rowling's experience seemed really personal. And it seems like maybe there was something that happened in her life that really bothered her. And she has some, I'm hoping that J.K. Rowling, as disgusting as her attitude towards that community has been, I'm hoping that she has a chance to evolve. I mean, so we're wondering now, and I think Pat called it out too, like, where do we draw that line, especially with the artists? And Dr. Munoz was beautiful in this Malcolm Gladwell kind of way, with the way he took this tipping point version of dissociating people. But I feel like some of these people have an opportunity to evolve. It'll be a scar. We'll remember it, but hopefully they can do better and bounce back. Cosby's gone. Cosby's dead to me. R. Kelly's dead to me. The NFL, I don't know. I feel like they're dead to me, but I grew up with them, so maybe they have an opportunity to evolve. But I'm hoping that there's an opportunity for some of these people to evolve, and I'm seeing a lot of it in our own community as well.
Yeah, I mean, to build on that and to address to your question as well, Pat, you know, I think that there's always been room for art that has been a byproduct of people that, you know, have issues. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. I mean, I think there's always been room for art and for expression. And I don't think that's what we're confronted with today, as much as, you know, whether we are investing public dollars in these kind of monuments that are built up to praise, you know, an individual historical figure. I don't think what's being judged is as much the art as it is the kind of the sponsorship of the state, right, around the kind of messaging that has been developed around that art piece. So I mean, this is why people are saying, if it's in a museum, let it be in a museum, right? But you know, don't fund it within a public park, or don't fund its maintenance in a public park. I think there, from my perspective, I maybe, you know, I think we always have to be careful, right? When you look at dystopian films, you know, Roberto, I mean, any movie we've seen, you know, tear down everything, right? Like tear down every piece of art, every building, every cathedral. I feel like I have had concerns recently about, you know, if you think about slippery slope with religious freedom in particular, like, you know, when do certain institutions, religious institutions that have been persecuted over time, now become the target? And I feel like there have been some, you know, far left groups that have already tried to take the conversation there. So I do think, you know, my hope as a country is that we can still, you know, protect religious freedom and you know, artistic expression, to your point, Pat. But that's hope, and I do think it's going to take an active discussion, and frankly, it is going to take some pushback. You know, even if you're on the side of the Columbus statue going down, I mean, you know, and I am like of it not being publicly sponsored in a park or elevated as a hero, but you know, I don't believe that synagogues, churches, right, or mosques should be torn down. So with that said, let's kind of make a little transition here. So we know that there's been a lot of this going on, right? The social crisis, if you will. But we are still in a pandemic. We are still in a health crisis, and associated with that health crisis is economic crisis. And as a result of those two elements being, you know, having tension between the economic and the health crisis, we find ourselves now kind of pushing forward to address the economic crisis while somewhat disregarding the healthcare crisis, right? So we're moving into phase 3 of reopening the economy here in the state of Rhode Island, while we're also seeing throughout the rest of the United States cases spiking in states like Arizona. And that leads me to be very concerned because of my time on the Equity Council here in the state of Rhode Island, which I have the privilege of serving on with Roberto. And we really were placed there by community leaders that advocated for our presence there because they knew that we would push back and that we would challenge the administration and try to seek out the truth of what has been going on and how resources are allocated, where they're allocated to, and whether it's done in an equitable way. And what we've learned time and time again is that this administration does not take strategic advice. It has a plan, it has a vision, and despite the fact that it is very slow to implement that vision and inefficient in executing on every component of that vision, which is predisposing communities like Central Falls, Providence, and Pawtucket to further spread or potential resurgence, I would say, of COVID-19 and risking our youth as we open up education. Despite all that, the fact that the risk seems to still be present, we're now moving into phase 3. So Bill, can you give us an update on what phase 3 looks like? What are the revisions? And maybe after that, we can have Pat and Roberto address their concerns with, how that's taking place.
Sure. Well, for anyone who wants the hyper specifics, the best bet is to head over to reopeningri.com, and you can find all the lists of, how a venue is going to look, or how, a sidewalk is, or a pet store, whatever it may be, is pretty much on there. The summary, the short 30-second summary, is that things are moving rapidly and they're opening up in a way that will be very similar to where we were before this pandemic in many sectors. Okay, so outdoor venues, outdoor events, the encouraged cap is 250 people. But look, there's not going to be any law enforcement or any kind of oversight on these events for the most part. So what you're starting to see now is really an aggressive push to stimulate the economy through returning to some sort of normal by this administration. And I think the biggest thing that caught my attention over the last few days as they've been rolling it out is you take a look at specific examples like live music, okay? They really don't have a plan in place for how they want to handle this. When it comes to bars, the governor has said time and time again, look, bars are the most dangerous place when it comes to the Texas and the Florida spikes. We can trace bars and people in their 20s primarily without masks standing around congregating at bars we can correlate that with major spikes. Yet they're also saying here in Rhode Island, well, you can have a live music event as long as there's less than whatever it is, 50 or 100 people. Well, live music takes place in bars. So from my perspective, I'm getting messages from venues all around the state, from Block Island, Newport, Providence, South County, saying, are we able to have a show? I mean, the governor says we can, but we also don't want to be the front line contributing to the next surge or resurgence of the virus here in the state. So that's one hyper-specific example, but it's based around the arena that is seemingly the most dangerous, which is people congregating in entertainment environments and not taking proper precautions when it comes to masking, social distancing, or otherwise. So phase 3, it sets us up where, yes, there are a lot of specific details around gyms and barbershops and so on and so forth, but in the most dangerous sectors, there's not clear guidance, and they still don't really have a grasp on how they want to proceed.
It's been how many weeks since the principal Black Lives Matter march? Has it been 3?
It's been 4 now, I think, right? Hasn't?
We're going on 4.
Yep.
And I guess what's fascinating about that to me, and I had the privilege of marching along with folks on this show at one point or another. I think we all managed to have a conversation and walk alongside each other at one point. The area was singularly compressed. Largely with young people who I think are starting, there's a little tinge of scapegoating on there right now from the governor's office. Just kind of throw that out there. To me, it was astonishing the degree with which folks were wearing masks. In fact, I was rightfully castigated a few times kind of being the geezer there, it was ironic that I was the one that had to be reminded to put my mask on. I'm going to throw this out at the doctor, put him on the spot a little bit. I'm not aware, and this presents two challenges. Number one, the challenge to the argument that is the status quo, that people should not congregate in large compressed settings like that, which, to Bill's point, is largely representative of an outdoor music festival. I mean, they reminded me a lot of an outdoor music festival for a lot of positive reasons, as well as the potential for reinfection. Is the fact that we are one of the two states in the nation where cases are going down, despite the fact that we had 10 to 12,000 people standing elbow to elbow to elbow to elbow, is that a reflection of the fact that maybe we are getting past this? Or B, is that a continued testament to the lack of testing, if you will, in the minority-majority community? And both of those, to me, are critically important questions. So I'm going to, in a sense, throw it back to the doctor and ask him what he feels about that.
Yeah, I mean, despite what we're saying about what the governor is saying about testing, I don't think we're doing enough. And here's why. I've mentioned this before. I'll just rehash it. There is a certain error rate, right? So out of every 10 people, 3 people that are positive, out of 10 positive people that do the nasopharyngeal test, the one where they put it deep in your nose, 3 out of those 10 that are positive will walk away thinking they're negative. That's the error rate. Now, when you think about the CVS test, out of 10 people that are positive, it's likely that 5 of them will walk away thinking they're negative when they're actually positive. So that's the difference in error rate, right? And yet we still have a reliance on the CVS test. Time after time, I have asked the testing stream and those that have come on in front of the Equity Council whether we will replace our CVS testing with standard testing, which does take 2 to 3 days in terms of the time it takes to get results. It's a little delayed, it's not as rapid, but we get more accurate results. And while there's this vision that we eventually will, the fact is we haven't. And now is the time to do it, if anything, and yet we still haven't. Now, why haven't we? Well, with this rapid test, when you're pushing numbers out, it makes the statistics work to your advantage if your political narrative is focused on doing a certain number of tests so that you can say that you're relatively better in terms of your testing system than other states. So it's been largely political. Now, let's talk about the science here, because, Pat, you brought up an important issue. So when we think about the spread of this disease, we know they calculate something called a dispersion factor. So we know that there are people that might be considered super spreaders. Now, super spreaders isn't like a certain type of disease carrier that's different than another, that is like spraying viruses out of their, every orifice of their body. That's not the case. Super spreaders, there's a behavioral factor associated with super spreaders, right? There's something about them. It could be the context, right? The community in which they are, a bit of their behavior, but something about them that essentially leads them to infect many more other people. And so they spread the disease to many people. If they're in a protest, it could be, to more than what would be expected. So we would normally expect 2 to 3 people infected by every single person, but a super spreader might infect 10 people or more. So when you think about bars, as compared to the protest, because the protest, again, you think about it, a protest is as long as there's not an unusual disturbance, I'll use that language, it's a pretty controlled event, right? You're marching from one location to the other, you're wearing a mask, even the words and the chants that everyone is saying in solidarity, most of that is controlled. You do have individuals that may lose control at times, but most of it is controlled. And so that's very different from a bar where people are taking shots, where the consumption of alcohol may lead to disinhibitions. So you may not respect the 6 feet distance, 6 foot, rule. You may speak louder because music is playing. And so as you speak louder, there's more projection of aerosolized viral particles. And so again, contextually, there's a greater risk for one of those super spreaders in a bar, given the nature of what's happening in a bar, to spread the disease to many more people. So I wouldn't use a protest, which is relatively a controlled environment, with, with a bar, because again, in a bar, I hate to draw this conclusion because there are people who go to bars that don't drink, but there is a greater likelihood that there would be consumption of beverages, that there would be music in the background, and that there would be loud speaking, right? So not everyone drinks, I get that, but there's a greater likelihood. So that's the science behind this, Pat. I do not believe personally that heat, outside of the sun's direct illumination, like the UV light from the sun on a surface with the virus, which I believe would destroy the virus, right, based on what we know. Beyond that idea, high temperature itself does not reduce the likelihood of this virus spreading. There are other factors that may, high humidity, because of density, the density of that humidity may force someone's spit, essentially aerosolized particles, to actually get pulled down to the ground faster. These minor factors we haven't done extensive studies to know. So I've taken up a lot of time with this, but since you pull me in, Pat, I did want to make sure that I addressed all the potential scientific aspects of this. But I kind of want to bring it back to Roberto. So a few things have been mentioned since we started with this conversation about phase 3, and business, types of business, spread, or the lower cases that we're seeing, the likelihood that we would see resurgences. But in all of this phase 3 opening, what's your perspective on where youth are today, what they're thinking, and especially going into the school year, whether youth are actually prepared to go back to school?
The youth have no idea what to expect in September, or August 31st, the start date for Rhode Island returning to school. And the reason they have no idea what to expect for that is because the adults and the administrators have no idea what to expect. We are planning. It's funny because I've been really aggressive with them about some of the injustices that we have in the classroom. But at the same time, there are times where we need to stand up and applaud for them, because they are being asked to do their work in triplicate. They're being asked to prepare for their work for in-person, like always. They're being asked to prepare for their work for a digital model, and they're being asked to prepare for their work for a hybrid model as well for their classrooms. Can you imagine the difficulty there, not knowing when you're going to see your class, on what days, in what format? It's really mission impossible, and they've been knocking it out the park, because this is the time for innovation. So they've been doing really well with that. I am the biggest critic of our Department of Ed, especially PPSD. Don't get me started. But they've been innovating pretty well. But again, there is not. I don't know how I can be in the room. I don't know how I can be in the meetings, rather, right? To be working on preparing stuff for students to be working together in pods, not even August 31st. I'm talking before then too, in some of the summer programs that they're going to be having in the schools. We're having these meetings over Zoom. Do you know why we're having these meetings over Zoom? It's because it's not safe to have these meetings in person right now because of the pandemic. It's not safe to have these meetings in person, and yet we're expecting the students to get together and be working together in person. And here's how we're doing it. It's pretty smart. Their soft plans so far include putting the students in pods. So they're going to be putting the students in pods so that if anyone's sick, it'll be contained to that group of students. Let's say 20, probably even smaller than that. But I don't think that's good enough, because if you're one of those other 19 students in that pod, you are now trapped, you know what I mean, with like this incredible pathogen. I don't want to put a scarlet letter on the student. I don't want to vilify the student who's the victim and is sick, but it's almost like being trapped in there with the aliens, and you got your little radar and the dots are all around you, man. There's nothing you can do. You're going to be stuck in that pod. You can presume that they're probably all going to be sick. So from a student perspective, I'm really worried about that specifically. But let me take it a layer back. As I check in with my students, as I do often, I'm also finding that that a lot more of them are sick, or had been sick, than had even occurred to me, right? Like, a lot of people are still pretending that this is no worse than the flu and all this stuff. And I'm thinking about people that I know that have died. And when I check in with students, I've got students and their whole families have gotten this COVID illness, right? And I'm really struggling with that because it is there. And there's this one more thought of Rhode Island. When we think about Rhode Island and being the smallest state, and we pat ourselves on the back because statistically we are one of two states who are doing well. What's the word? We're doing well, like by the standards of the other states, right? Like in comparison, in context with the other states. But Rhode Island also doesn't have borders, right? Like if I wanted to go across into Connecticut, you know what I mean? That's a walkable thing. If you wanted to go across to Massachusetts, especially from my house, that's a walkable thing. You can walk across that line. So these borders are not, there's not checkpoints at these borders, and nor should there be. But what I'm trying to say is people come and go really frequently, right? And especially with my youth, especially the youth that I'm serving that have a lot of family in Boston, a lot of family in New York, commuting back and forth all the time. So you can't look at Rhode Island and think, hey, we're good because like we're somehow isolated. We're not. Even if the numbers are good.
I think we lost Roberto in there. The rest of us still here?
Yeah. It's all right. So hopefully we'll pull Roberto back in. But just to build on what Roberto was saying, I mean, I agree, right? Like we are. So Roberto, you kind of cut off towards the end. Good to see you again. Yeah. So you finish your thought.
My last thought is please don't kill my grandpa. Okay. My grandpa turns 90 years old today. Emilio Matos. Shout out to my grandpa. I don't have a very close relation. I don't see him very often. But there's that family love, right? So since it's his 90th birthday, they decided to throw a big birthday party and get the entire family, everybody in the family together and celebrate him. And I've already seen the social media posts of all of these different people hugging and kissing on my grandpa. Not a single mask in the pictures that I've seen. I don't want to say nobody wore a mask, but I haven't seen one. Like, this isn't just my family. I saw a picture of Mr. Lemon, people celebrating a birthday. I don't want to vilify. It's some kid's birthday. Good for him. I'm happy. And the same thing with another friend of mine whose daughter graduated from high school. That's amazing. They had a big party in the backyard. I'm happy that they have something to celebrate, right? That's great. I'm happy they have something to celebrate, but I'm afraid that the monster is still out there, and I'd hate for somebody to get sick. Chances are they might not get sick, but I'd hate for something. Please don't kill my grandpa is my point.
Yeah, no, I mean, I understand and I empathize with you. I mean, I'm certainly worried about my parents and frankly, just worried about all the communities, right, and loved ones. And it hurts more when you know that you knew, right, and then it happens. When you know that there were warnings, that there are things that we could have done, and then something tragic happens. And I do agree that. Rhode Island can't distance itself from nearby states, and I think that we should be planning for the worst. And it does seem like the state is heading in a direction where it assumes that it's doing everything well and that it's safe. And politically, that may be a great narrative. Unfortunately, as you and I have seen, Roberto, it's not only politics. I think this administration is believing its own narrative, and that's dangerous. For the state of Rhode Island, when you believe your lie, right? And so here we are, having discussed a lot of important topics that we've been faced with here in the state of Rhode Island, and nationally, I think everyone's been faced with, from social issues to the healthcare crisis to some of the challenges that microentities and the music industry are facing. But I think it's important to kind of summarize each of our senses or each of our perspectives and what is outraging us at this point. What's going to keep each of us up at night if you had to prioritize all of the many issues we're faced with. And so let's start today with Pat, and then we'll go around and get to everyone else.
So my outrage, and I expressed this at the press availability yesterday with Gina Raimondo. One of the departments, I should say, because I don't want to personalize this, that has to go is what was formerly known as the Economic Development Corp, now known as the Commerce Corporation. They are engaged in a process where they are using the Trump administration, of all cases, the Opportunity Zone program to do a mixed-use development in Pawtucket. So what's the problem with that, right? We all want development. Well, let's first look at the type of development. It's a soccer stadium. Well, we know how well stadiums are doing. It's going to be a retail use, and we all know even before COVID that retail was going away. A high-end property, and probably some throw out to affordable housing. And so here I had the opportunity. It was just by coincidence that Stephen Pryor, the Secretary of Commerce Corp, happened to be there. So I asked a couple of very basic questions, which were all, I just think I summarized. But the most deathly portion of this is the great unknown, as is always the case with Rhode Island, these boondoggles. And what happens when the tax raised, and what they do is they cordon off a section of Pawtucket. It's called blighted, which of course is an insult to the people who live there. But we'll step aside from that. The sales tax that's generated by that area then goes to pay off, in many cases, the debt service for the state financing. So it's a huge giveaway. And on top of that, thanks to the Trump administration, who, shockingly enough, is now in cahoots, I guess, with Governor Raimondo, and most particularly the Commerce Corporation, they get happier capital gains treatment. Well, in asking for where things stood, I'd gotten used to, in a week or so, some fairly direct answers by Governor Raimondo. This guy doesn't know whether or not these guys are going to financing. They've had the deadlines to get financing rolled back now. I think they're on their fourth try. He was unable to explain what would happen if there's a tax shortfall because of the obvious weaknesses of every single pillar of this plan. And then, and it's kind of comical because if you watch the video once or twice, he couldn't get off that stage fast enough. Why is this way talking about this on this show? First of all, it's an insult to taxpayers. You're using taxpayer risk to finance private profit. But I just want to throw out there questions like this. In a city like Pawtucket, who is development for? Is development supposed to uplift, if you will, the lives of the people who've lived in that community, for some cases, many generations? Or is development for, and particularly egregious in this situation, is based on the, if you will, the private fortunes now of a select few, to create an environment which will just really rip that community up, probably provide no economic gain, confiscate private property, and essentially weaponize Rhode Island government to gentrify neighborhoods for which there is hardly enough affordable housing to begin with. Now, I believe in market solutions, all that. I don't believe in government solutions. But what we've got here, once again, is the Raimondo administration using taxpayer gain to socialize risk and privatize profit. And at what point in time does the community, what I mean by that is, of course, the urban core that we talk about on this show, rise up to Mayor Grebian and say, enough? That's my outrage and my question.
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much for sharing that, Pat. I mean, I think it's an important issue. Opportunity zones are interesting. I've always wondered how much power governors have, right, in determining what opportunities, what community will qualify as an opportunity zone. I think there is some freedom there that the governor has.
Right.
And I wanted to say that specifically because what we need to understand, and this is coming from my experience on the Equity Council, is that this administration does not care about equity. This administration does not intentionally and proactively address equity issues when it allocates funding. And if it hasn't done that historically, if it isn't doing that for the COVID-19 crisis, pandemic, then it definitely will not do that in the establishment of these opportunity zones and how those opportunity zones grow. And I would just add that Pawtucket, you brought this up before, Pat, and I think it's very interesting. And this is why I often say urban core communities and communities of color, because based on the demographics in Pawtucket, I think many of those community members maybe disconnect themselves from some of these discussions around equity issues when they shouldn't, right? When they're just as important for that community. So I just want to build on that. And with that said, let's jump into Bill's outrage.
Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our
your exact needs.
Great commercial. All right, Bill. So you want to start back up?
Yeah, why not? It by the way, it beats the Zolano Insurance theme song, that's for sure. I mean, I wake up in the middle of the night with that particular or Rhode Island Credit Union,
go. Solano.
Holy Moses. My outrage is that, I spend a lot of time in Newport. I lived there for a couple of years when I moved back to Rhode Island. And frankly, a good chunk of my community is centered around Newport. And it's been really difficult for really some of my closest friends. We haven't really been able to spend any time together. And the summer is prime time, to go and explore or go, take advantage of the natural spaces in Newport, or even just to hang out in the backyard and, talk about the work we're doing in different, especially in a moment like this where there's some community activists down there, and just there would be a highly productive conversation. But we've taken a lot of precautions and basically not had these gatherings ourselves. But this past weekend, Saturday and Sunday, we were down there, my wife and I, and we went to the beach, sort of a secret beach that we know about, and went downtown and walked around and so forth. And I was just amazed by the lack of compliance by, I'm going to go ahead and throw out the number 90% of people weren't wearing masks. You've got some of these bars that are catered towards tourists and bridal parties that are absolutely packed. There's no one doing any kind of contact tracing at the door. And lo and behold, now we have several of those spaces that have had customers and staff test positive for COVID. And I even asked, Pat was there yesterday, I asked Director Alexander Scott, what's the protocol for a restaurant or a bar that has people who test positive in it? Do they have to shut down? What does that look like? And it's just frustrating from a very selfish standpoint, because the Newport community that is there year round has actually, by and large, been masking, has been doing a great job of not living their lives to the fullest in order to benefit the state and country and world as a whole, right, in trying to get through the pandemic. And you've got this sort of frat brother, tourist mentality of, look, a lot of the folks who are there in Newport, they spend a lot of money and that generates a lot for the economy. But some of them with that money take a position that, look, this can't affect me. I'm above the COVID-19 crisis. I've got great medical care. So you end up in this situation where, once again, the vulnerable portions of Newport, which is very diverse. A lot of people think of Newport as all mansions and everything. It's actually a very diverse blue-collar town. And those people, my friends and the resident and the political leaders there are now subjected to this mass infiltration of people who just don't care at all. And it's time for, I guess I say the political leaders there, but it's time for the mayor and others to step up and enforce the regulations that they've already put forth, which is they say that you're supposed to wear a mask anywhere you go on a busy street. They're not doing that. But it's just outrageous that people would come to an island and act so selfishly and then go back home to Massachusetts or wherever they may live and really not be concerned about the impact that they're having on a working class town like Newport.
Yeah,
by the way,
thanks so much for bringing that up.
Could I just jump in for a second?
Pat.
That was Bill. You really set the room back with that question yesterday, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was thoroughly unanticipated. All of a sudden, everyone realized that if there is a flood at a restaurant or if there is an outbreak of, I don't know, some type of dysentery or something, or if there's a fire at a restaurant, then a flock of state officials parachute in and stabilize the situation, much like a crime scene. And there was this stunning moment when they realized that despite $1 billion spent, despite an international pandemic, that none of that happens at any businesses. I don't know if I'm advocating that it should, but it certainly hasn't been discussed, and there's certainly no protocols in place. So it's just an outstanding moment.
I appreciate it. I felt that same sort of temperature change in the room where, it was like, oh, okay, he's not asking about the Columbus statue right today. It's we're going into a specific area that is being overlooked. I mean, come on, you say bars are going to be the most dangerous spot for this to be transmitted. We've got positive tests. Well, what happens, especially when these are folks that are coming in from out of state?
Yeah, I mean, but let's also be clear. I mean, those are questions that you've asked before, Bill. Those are questions that we've been asking on the Equity Council. We've talked about resurgence response plans. No one's addressed it. They put doctors in front of us. They put all of these establishment employees in front of us. And it's not that they don't have the intellect to understand the question. But again, I think this really comes down to leadership and where the money's going, right? You can't create an operation that can have a response like that without actually actively investing in it. You just can't. So vision will take us won't take us very far if the money is not talking. So yeah, Bill, keep pushing, right? Keep pushing. You're doing a great job. Yeah. So Roberto, what's your outrage?
Man, Bill had mentioned, forgive me for taking a quick alternate route. Bill had mentioned people standing around a bar. And one of my educator friends is also a bartender, and I talked to her today. And she was very specific that people don't stand around bars. Yeah, you have a couple who hover, at the bar, but they'll go from the bar, they'll go to a table, they'll see a friend, they'll get up, they're all over the bar by the end of the night. And it's like one of those family circus cartoons where he's all over the neighborhood. Those are the kind of things that are happening. And you don't have your mask on, obviously, the whole time because you're eating and drinking, you're consuming. So your mask is coming off during part of your conversation as well. So even if we're talking about masked establishments, we're talking about establishments where you walk in wearing a mask, but you're not wearing a mask a lot of the time while you're in it. I also want to thank Pat for bringing up housing, because there is an impending housing crisis that some of us are starting to become aware of. And Dr. Munoz he's mentioned the Equity Council a number of times, but he's understating the fact that we're antagonists on that Equity Council, because what we're finding is that Equity Council is just a report out. You've got community leaders in that Equity Council, and they are not at all interested in any of our ideas. And from week one, Dr. Munoz has gone in and said, well, wait a minute, this is an area of my expertise. Can we do A, B, and C? And they've met him with resistance. They have talked down to him at first, right? Like a who's this guy kind of thing. And ultimately that now they're at least pretending to listen to him, right? Well, I don't know what the results of that are, but I know that they pretend to listen to him and meanwhile just give us their presentation every week without taking any input from their community leaders at all. If you have participated in one of those meetings, you'll hear me very upset about why aren't we addressing the youth? Why aren't we addressing mental wellness in response to the pandemic? Why aren't we addressing the impending housing crisis that's going to come? This is the group. You have leaders right here ready to do so. Sorry, because that's not what's keeping me up this week. What's keeping me up this week is I think bringing us all the way back around on this particular show, when we're talking about the statue and we're talking about a number of other things, I think it's great that Columbus statue is taken away from that part of town, right? It was an eyesore, and it's a signal of my people's genocide, right? I'm happy that stupid statue is gone. Keep taking down statues. Keep fighting for all of these things. I'm happy about some of the cancel culture. I'm happy that we're holding people accountable at least, right? I hope that doesn't mean I have to not watch my Puerto Rican Spider-Man, because that's important to me. But I'm happy that we're at least asking the questions and having the conversations. But what it all comes down to, and I hope we don't get distracted from it, what it all comes down to is people say, what's going to make this time different? What's going to make this time different is if we can actually hold the police accountable. If we can get convictions, meaningful convictions for the offenders, the people who are out there murdering our community members, that's when I think we'll have hit a tipping point. For my second reference to Malcolm Gladwell and the tipping point, I think that's when we will have hit a tipping point, and when people will see that they are being held accountable. My problem is the few bad apples theory, because we've seen time and time again too many bad apples to know that it's not a few. And a lot of people want to think that Officer Friendly from right here in Providence is their friend. I'm sorry to tell you, I'm sorry to break the news to you that maybe you don't have a video of them murdering someone, but I don't have to go too far back in my life to remember that they murdered somebody who was a friend of mine that I grew up with. They murdered somebody from my childhood about 20 years ago, and that person was one of them. That person was on Team Blue, and they murdered him because he was Black. Yes, it happens in the community. Yes, I'm referring back 20 years, and you might want to think, hey, you just said people evolve. Maybe they've evolved. Bullshit. Because when this stuff started to take over the country and break the news cycle of the pandemic, right? When this started to take over that news cycle, a lot of police officers Officer Friendly wanted to empathize with the community and say, hey, that sucks, but that's not me. I'm not that guy. And I saw those social media posts, but those same officers, I saw their social media posts about 2 weeks later when a donut shop took away discount for officers, right? So you take away their discount, now they're pissed off, and now they're not officer friendly anymore. And they're protected by their blue bubble. And we all have it. We all have our social media people who are going to jump to our defense and validate what we say on social media. But that's the danger, because blue is like a gang. It's like the Crips. They're a gang. Gang blue. Blue lives matter. There's no blue lives. You're people, right? Like your job's not alike. So here's where we are now. And I shared this with Dr. Munoz. There was a school squad officer, somebody who works with students, somebody who works in the schools with our students, who showed shared a video of New York police fighting back protesters. And their caption that they wrote was, it's about time we start to open a can of whoop ass. And they were supporting the idea of police violence on the community. This is Officer Friendly. This is the one that interacts with our young people every day, right? So I can't help myself. I feel like some people consider me to be one of those community leaders. I don't want to start a fight, so I'm not saying things that are too antagonistic. I just point out that, hey, that post can be viewed as violence from police to community. It seems like you're advocating for violence against the community. And here comes that blue bubble to support. That blue shield came in, including another school squad officer who I know, who actually started to make a reference to maybe she should have a talk with my mother, right? Like, because my mother hadn't given me enough cans of whoop ass. Now, maybe it's veiled. I don't know if you can, like, maybe we could take a vote on, do you think that's a veiled threat, or is that just a straight up threat? It doesn't matter. Either way, veiled or not, I think we'd all agree that it's a type of threat. These are officer friendly. These are Providence police officers that continue to work with our young people in our community every single day. Don't think that this is just happening in Minnesota. I'm not for defund the police. I'm for abolish the police. But I tell you what, I will take a consolation prize. That's actually what kept me up literally the other night. Thanks for asking.
I mean, thanks for sharing, Roberto. You know, I think when you have a profession where policies are built around instigation and escalation, right? And then you have this kind of protective framework that protects one side and not the other. I mean, then it predisposes it to corruption, right? On so many levels. So, you know, I don't think we're going to stop talking about that, right? I think next week we're going to be right here still seeing how that's evolving, and that's a good thing. So with that said, I want to kind of talk about my outreach, but I'm going to make it quick. I know that, you've all been on the call, and I want to also thank our listeners for joining us today and for listening to some of these profound ideas and some of, the issues that we're confronted with today. And when I say we, it's not only the people on this live stream, but it's also people in the community, right? The voices that we're lifting up here. And so my outrage, it's last week was a kind of a bit of a silent outrage or a low key outrage. And today, it follows that. I mean, week after week, you fight, as Roberto said, you push, you try to get answers, and all you get is resistance. All you get is talked to. And then something happens, and this is what people don't talk about as much. You start to see that individuals that have come together in a coalition, that are still together in this collective to make change, are being pursued in different ways by an administration that wishes to tokenize each of them, to make offers for them to be on different committees, to make offers for them to have more information than the other one might have, because you're lifted for this moment in time slightly above the other person. And they give you these small little crumbs to see if you bite. And the more you bite, the bigger the crumb. But at the end of the day, all they're really doing is isolating you from everyone else. And so for me, it's been disheartening. This, some of us know this, we talk about it all the time, but when you're actively experiencing it and you're putting energy into something and you see it happening, there's only one or two things you can do, right? You can kind of crawl up and retract into yourself and wonder whether you should keep pushing and probably fall into that sense of that cyclical self-reflection. Or you can get upset, and you can let that fire, that chip on your shoulder that they often try to quell by saying that that's representative of who you are and who your people are. And you can accept that for that moment and say, well, I'll be that person. I'll be the person, to Roberta's point, that's angry. I'll be the person that will call you out, that will call you a contributor to the systemic racism that communities continue to face, or perpetuator of systemic racism, despite the fact that you have color, but you've allowed yourself to be tokenized. And there's so many people out there preparing for 2022 that think that I and others on this call will not call them out or actively confront them in campaigns. So my outrage today is just, again, little, not so low key, but just preparing for the outrage that I'm going to experience tomorrow. If people continue to think that they're going to silence our voices, isolate us, and perpetuate the inequities and the injustices that we've been experiencing as individuals and as community members. So with that, I just want to, again, thank everyone for joining the call today. Thank you to my fellow co-host here, to all of the listeners. I would ask that you like this, that you share it, that you add comments to it, build on this discussion. All we've done here is try to seed future discussions, provide you with enough knowledge so that you can lift up that baton and push forward and race forward towards change. So thank you again. Join us next Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. here on Pump Up the Volume, streaming on the Coalition Radio Network. Thanks so much.
Good night, buddy.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.